The scratching started on a Tuesday. I need you to understand what that means. Not random animal sounds or wind through the trees. Deliberate scratching, methodical, like fingernails dragging across wood in measured strokes, testing each board, each joint, each weakness in the walls. My great-grandfather heard it first. Samuel Hendricks, 73 years old, deaf in one ear from a mining accident but sharp as a blade in everything else. He sat up in his bed that October night and listened to something work its way around the perimeter of the house, slow, patient, learning. When he told us the next morning, we figured it was raccoons, maybe a bear looking for winter food. The Appalachian hollows were full of creatures that got bold when the seasons changed. We'd lived in that narrow valley for 6 years without trouble. No reason to think this would be different. We were wrong about everything. 23 people called that hollow home in 1908. 3 families sharing the bottom land where Blackwater Creek made its lazy turn through the Kentucky mountains. The Hendricks farm sat deepest in the valley, tucked against the tree line where the hollow narrowed to nothing. My great-grandfather Samuel, his wife Martha, their 4 sons, 3 daughters, and a handful of grandchildren who'd come to help with the late harvest. I'm telling you this because in 3 days, most of them would be dead. The others wished they were. My name is Robert Hendricks. I'm 87 years old, and I'm the last one who remembers. The last one who was there when the pale things came down from the ridges and laid siege to our home. When something that had been watching us from the deep woods finally decided to act. The state of Kentucky buried the official report in 1909, called it a tragic accident in the newspapers. Mountain fever, they said, exposure and panic. 20 people dead in a remote hollow, cause unknown, case closed. I've spent my whole life watching that lie stand as truth, watching the world forget what really happened in that valley, what came for us in the darkness, and why so few lived to see another dawn. I'm dying now. Heart's giving out, doctor says, maybe 2 months, maybe less. When I go, the truth goes with me unless I set it down somewhere safe. So here it is, finally. What happened in Cutter's Hollow in October of 1908, what the pale things did to my family, what they tried to do to me. The hollow ran east to west for maybe 2 miles, narrow as a rifle barrel, with steep ridges rising on both sides like the walls of a green cathedral. Blackwater Creek meandered down the center, clear as glass in the summer, thick with mud and fallen leaves come autumn. The trees grew so dense overhead that even at midday, the sun only touched the ground in scattered patches. It was beautiful country, isolated, private. The kind of place where a man could raise his family without interference from the outside world. It was also the perfect trap. The 3 homesteads sat within a quarter mile of each other, close enough for help, but far enough for privacy. The Colemans held the entrance to the valley where the hollow opened onto the county road. Good farming people, been there since before the Civil War. The Brysons had the middle ground where the creek made a wide bend, ran cattle and grew corn for the Hopkinsville market. We had the far end where the hollow pinched closed and the mountains rose straight up like walls, the darkest spot, the quietest, and when things went wrong, the most cut off from the world outside. Samuel had chosen that spot deliberately. He'd come to Kentucky after the war, looking for land where a man could live by his own rules. Found this narrow valley and saw opportunity where others saw isolation. Built his cabin by hand, stone foundation and oak timber, meant to last 100 years. He might have made it if he'd known what lived in the ridges above us. The house sat on a small rise about 50 yards from the creek, surrounded by cleared ground where we grew corn and tobacco. Apple trees marked the corners of the property, heavy with fruit that October. The barn stood behind the house, built into the hillside for winter protection. A good setup. A safe setup. Or so we thought. Beyond the cleared ground, the forest began. Old growth timber, some of it, trees thick as houses, undergrowth so dense you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Game trails wound through the maze like spider webs, following logic only the animals understood. Samuel used to say those woods held secrets older than human memory. Cherokee had hunted there for generations before the white settlers came. They had names for the ridges, stories about things that moved through the deep forest when the moon was dark. We should have listened to those stories, But we were modern people, living in the new century. We had rifles and oil lamps and the confidence that came with civilization's tools. The old superstitions belonged to the past, like slavery and the war and all the other darkness we'd left behind. The Cherokee hadn't left anything behind. They'd been driven out, forced west on the Trail of Tears, but their warnings stayed carved into the very bones of the mountains. We just didn't know how to read them. The scratching started on Tuesday, October 13th. Samuel heard it first, sometime past midnight, a sound like branches dragging against the house, but there was no wind. He lay in bed listening to something work its way around the building's perimeter, testing the walls, the window frames, the foundation stones. When he got up to look, whatever it was stopped. Wednesday night, it came back. This time, Martha heard it too. They stood at the parlor window, staring out into darkness so complete it might have been the bottom of a well. The oil lamp in Martha's hands threw a weak circle of yellow light that barely reached the glass, and beyond that circle, nothing. But something was out there. They could feel it watching. Samuel loaded his Winchester and opened the front door. The cool October air rushed in, carrying the smell of dying leaves and creek water. And something else. Something sharp and organic, like copper pennies left in the rain. "Who's out there?" he called into the darkness. His voice echoed off the ridge walls and came back empty. "Show yourself!" The scratching stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. Thursday brought the first glimpse. Mary Hendricks, Samuel's youngest daughter, was drawing water from the well just after sunset when she saw them. 3 pale shapes moving through the apple trees at the edge of the cleared ground. Too tall to be children, too thin to be men. She dropped her bucket and ran for the house, screaming for her father. By the time Samuel reached the yard with his rifle, the shapes were gone. But the bucket lay on its side, water seeping into the dry earth, and the rope hung slack down the well shaft like something had cut it clean through. "What did you see, girl?" Mary was shaking so badly she could barely speak. "People," she whispered. "White people, but wrong somehow. Their eyes," she shuddered. "Their eyes were too big, and they moved like water." Samuel examined the rope. The cut was clean, made with something sharp, but there were no footprints in the soft earth around the well. No sign that anyone had been there at all. That night, the whole family gathered in the parlor. Samuel's 4 sons cleaned their rifles while the women mended clothes and tried to act like nothing was wrong. But every small sound made them freeze. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant call of a night bird. The scratching started at 10 o'clock, not just on one wall this time. All around the house, like a dozen, somethings had surrounded the building and begun testing it simultaneously. Methodical, patient, working with the coordination of a military unit. Samuel posted his boys at the windows while he checked the doors. Heavy oak barriers, barred with iron, built to keep out bears and mountain lions. They'd always felt solid before. Now they seemed thin as paper. The scratching continued for an hour. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. "They're learning the house," Samuel told his oldest son, James, "finding the weak spots." "What are they, Pa?" Samuel stared out the window at the darkness beyond the glass. "I don't know, boy, but they're not finished with us." Friday night, we saw them clearly. I was 12 years old then, helping my great-grandfather with the evening chores. We'd moved most of the livestock into the barn, sensing something in the air that made the animals nervous. The chickens refused to leave their coop. The milk cow lowed constantly, staring at the tree line with wide, rolling eyes. Even the dogs knew. Rex and Blue, hunting hounds that had never backed down from a bear, spent the day hiding under the porch with their tails between their legs. As darkness fell, we gathered in the main room. 23 people crowded into a space meant for half that many. Samuel had decided we should stay together, all of us in one place where we could watch the doors and windows. The oil lamps burned bright, pushing back the shadows, but making the windows into black mirrors that showed us nothing of what waited outside. We could have been at the bottom of the ocean for all we could see beyond the glass. Martha served cornbread and beans, but nobody had much appetite. The children huddled close to their mothers, sensing the adults' fear even if they didn't understand it. The men checked their rifles for the dozenth time, counting cartridges and making sure the actions were clean. Then, just as the old clock on the mantel chimed 9, they came. The first one appeared at the parlor window like a pale ghost materializing from the night. Tall as a man but thin as a fence post, with skin the color of fresh milk. Its head was too large for its body, and its eyes, God help me, its eyes were the size of saucers, round and black and perfectly reflecting the lamplight like polished stones. Martha screamed. James raised his rifle, and more faces appeared at the other windows, pressing against the glass, staring at us with those enormous, impossible eyes. They didn't look angry or hungry or threatening. They looked curious, like children peering into a dollhouse, fascinated by the tiny people moving around inside. Samuel fired through the window. The glass exploded outward in a shower of sharp fragments, and the pale face disappeared. But when we rushed to look, there was nothing there. No body, no blood, no sign that anything had ever stood outside that window. And the other faces remained, watching us with patient interest. "How many of them are there?" James whispered. We counted. 8 windows around the main room, a pale face at everyone, motionless, observing. As we watched, more appeared at the second-floor windows, then at the kitchen window, the pantry. Every piece of glass in the house became a frame for those otherworldly features. They'd surrounded us completely. Samuel broke the silence. "Everyone away from the windows, now." We pulled back to the center of the room, forming a tight circle around the children. The pale things pressed closer to the glass, their breath fogging the windows. One of them raised what might have been a hand and tapped against the pane with something that sounded like bone on glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was picked up by another window, then another. Soon the entire house rang with the rhythmic percussion of those pale hands drumming against the glass, a hollow symphony that seemed to come from every direction at once. Then they began to move. Not walking, exactly. Flowing. Like water poured from one container to another, they drifted around the house in a slow procession, always keeping those great dark eyes fixed on us through the windows, always maintaining that careful distance that kept them just beyond rifle range. "What do they want?" Martha whispered. Samuel shook his head. "Don't know, but they're not leaving." The tapping continued until midnight. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the pale things vanished into the darkness. One moment they were there, filling every window with their strange, luminous faces. The next, the glass showed only our own reflections, staring back at us from the lamplight. But we knew they hadn't gone far. Saturday brought a new horror. We found the animals first. Rex and Blue, our faithful hunting dogs, lay in the yard with their necks broken and their bodies arranged in a perfect circle around the well. They hadn't been killed in a fight. Their fur was clean, their bodies unmarked except for the fatal wounds. Someone had posed them, turned their heads toward the house, left them as a message. The chickens were gone, all of them. The coop stood empty, the door hanging open, no blood or feathers to show what had happened. 30 birds vanished without a trace, as if they'd simply walked into the night of their own accord. But it was the cow that shook us most. Bessie was our milk cow, a gentle Holstein who'd never hurt a living thing. We found her in the barn, still alive but changed. She stood in the center of the stall, perfectly motionless, staring at the wall with those same enormous dark eyes we'd seen at the windows. Her eyes had grown. Somehow, impossibly, they'd expanded to twice their normal size, black and reflective and utterly alien in her familiar bovine face. When James approached with a rope halter, she turned that transformed gaze on him, and he stumbled backward, white as chalk. "She's one of them now," he whispered. Samuel raised his rifle, but Martha caught his arm. "She's just a cow, Sam, just scared." But when Martha stepped forward to calm the animal, Bessie opened her mouth and made a sound no cow had ever made. A high, keening wail that echoed off the barn rafters and sent ice water through our veins. The sound went on, rising and falling like a human voice, singing in a language that predated words. Samuel shot her where she stood. The sound stopped, but the silence that followed felt even worse. We spent Saturday barricading the house, boards across the windows nailed tight, furniture pushed against the doors, every rifle loaded and ready. We'd decided to make our stand in the main room where we could watch all approaches and concentrate our fire. The children helped where they could, carrying nails and fetching tools, but mostly they stayed quiet and wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of our situation without fully understanding it. The adults worked in grim silence, hammering boards and checking weapons, preparing for a siege we didn't understand against an enemy we couldn't identify. As the sun set, we gathered in our makeshift fortress. 23 people in a room lit by oil lamps, armed with 5 rifles and whatever courage we could muster. The boarded windows made the space feel like a cave, cutting us off from the outside world, but also protecting us from those terrible watching eyes. Martha distributed what food we had: cold biscuits and preserves, jerky and water from the cistern. We ate mechanically, knowing we needed strength for whatever was coming, but tasting nothing. Our attention focused on every sound from outside. The walls were thick oak logs chinked with mud and moss. The roof was solid timber and slate. The house had sheltered the Hendricks family through 6 Kentucky winters. It had weathered storms and floods and the occasional visits of bears looking for easy food. But we'd never faced anything like this. As full darkness fell, the sounds began. Not scratching this time, pounding, heavy impacts against the walls that shook dust from the rafters and made the oil lamps flicker. Something was throwing itself against the house with tremendous force, testing the strength of our defenses. Samuel positioned us at the gaps between boards, peering out through narrow slits at the darkness beyond. "Don't waste ammunition," he warned. "Only shoot if you're sure of your target." The pounding circled the house, moving from wall to wall like something was systematically testing each section for weakness. When it reached the front wall where I was stationed, the impacts were so violent that I felt them in my chest, a rhythmic thundering that matched my terrified heartbeat. Through the gap in the boards, I caught glimpses of pale shapes moving in the darkness, tall and fluid, circling the house in a deliberate pattern. Too many to count, more than we'd seen before. As if others had joined the siege, called from the deep mountains by some signal we couldn't hear. Then, the singing started. High, wordless voices rising from the darkness around us, harmonizing in chords that hurt to hear. Not human voices. Something else, something that understood melody but not meaning, mimicking the patterns of human song without comprehending their purpose. The sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It made your skin crawl, even as it pulled at something deep in your chest, a longing you couldn't name for something you'd never had. "Don't listen," Samuel commanded. "Block your ears if you have to." But the song penetrated everything. It came through the walls, through our hands pressed against our ears, through the very bones of our skulls. Several of the children began to cry. One of my cousins, little Sarah, started toward the door as if she intended to go outside and join the chorus. James grabbed her before she could reach the barricade. She fought him with surprising strength, her small fists beating against his chest while she stared at the blocked doorway with eyes that reflected the lamplight like mirrors. For a moment, just a moment, her eyes looked too large for her face. The singing continued until dawn. Then, as the first gray light touched the ridgetops, it faded into silence. The pounding stopped. The pale shapes melted back into the forest like mist before the sun. We were alone again, but we knew they'd be back. Sunday morning brought no peace. We found new signs around the property. Circles drawn in the dirt with sticks or bones, always centered on one of the buildings. Strange symbols carved into the apple trees, cut deep into the bark with something sharp. The well rope had been tied into complicated knots that hurt to look at, patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. But most disturbing were the gifts. Small offerings left on the porch, the windowsills, the doorstep. Bird bones arranged in careful patterns, smooth stones that felt warm to the touch. Flowers we'd never seen before, pale and luminescent, that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and photographs. Daguerreotypes in cracked silver frames, showing people we didn't recognize, men and women in old-fashioned clothes posed formally before painted backdrops. But their eyes were wrong, too large, too dark, too knowing. As if whatever had taken the photographs had also changed the subjects, making them into something not quite human. Samuel gathered the offerings and threw them into the creek. But the images from those photographs lingered in our minds, faces that looked almost familiar, as if we'd seen them in dreams we couldn't quite remember. The day passed in preparation. We rationed our remaining food, checked the barricades, counted ammunition. Samuel sent his oldest son, James, to try reaching the Coleman place at the mouth of the hollow. Maybe they could ride for help. Maybe the sheriff in Hopkinsville would listen to reason. James never came back. We watched from the gaps in the boarded windows as he rode down the creek road on his horse, a rifle across his saddle, moving at a steady canter toward the world beyond the mountains. For a few minutes, we felt hope. Help was coming. The authorities would investigate. Whatever was happening in our isolated valley would finally receive attention from the outside world. Then, we saw the pale shapes moving through the trees alongside the road. They kept pace with James easily, flowing through the forest like water, always staying just at the edge of vision. We watched until horse and rider disappeared around the bend where the hollow opened onto the county road. An hour later, the horse came back alone. It walked slowly up the creek road, reins dragging, saddle empty. James's rifle was gone. His hat hung from the saddle horn, but there was no other sign of what had happened to him. Samuel caught the horse and examined it carefully. No blood, no wounds. The animal seemed calm, even peaceful, but its eyes had changed. They were larger than before, darker, reflecting the afternoon light like black mirrors. We turned the horse loose and it wandered toward the tree line, moving with that same fluid grace we'd seen in the pale things. When it reached the forest edge, it looked back at us once with those transformed eyes, then disappeared into the undergrowth. We never saw James again. But sometimes, in the nights that followed, we heard his voice calling from somewhere in the dark woods, asking us to come outside, telling us everything was all right, promising that the pale things meant us no harm. We knew better than to answer. Sunday night, they tried to come inside. The pounding started earlier this time, just after sunset. But instead of random impacts against the walls, we heard specific sounds. Tools working at the barricades, the screech of nails being pulled from wood, the careful removal of boards we'd nailed across the windows. "They're taking down our defenses," Samuel whispered. We pressed our eyes to the remaining gaps and watched pale hands working at the barriers with impossible patience. Long, thin fingers that moved like spider legs, testing each nail, each board, each weakness in our makeshift fortification. They worked in complete silence except for the sound of wood splintering and nails groaning under stress. One by one, our barricades came down, first the kitchen window, then the parlor, then the back door where we'd stacked furniture 3 feet high. The pale things dismantled our defenses piece by piece, methodically, efficiently, like they'd done this before. "Fire," Samuel commanded. We opened up with everything we had. 5 rifles shooting through the gaps, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness, gunpowder smoke filling the room until we could barely breathe. The sound was deafening in the closed space, but we kept firing until our ammunition ran low. When the smoke cleared, the pale things were still there, not wounded, not even slowed down. The bullets seemed to pass right through them without effect, as if they were made of mist rather than flesh. They continued their work, removing boards, clearing windows, opening our fortress to the night. Soon, we could see them clearly through the unbarricaded windows, dozens of them surrounding the house, watching us with those enormous dark eyes, tall and pale and impossibly thin, moving with liquid grace as they completed the destruction of our defenses. And now, we could see their faces clearly. Human faces, or close to human, but stretched and altered as if someone had taken a normal person and pulled them like taffy until the proportions were wrong. The eyes were the worst part, huge black orbs that took up half the face, reflecting our lamplight like pools of dark water. They pressed against the windows, staring at us with patient curiosity. Their breath fogged the glass. Their pale hands left smudges on the panes. And gradually, one by one, they began to smile. The smiles were wrong, too wide, too knowing. The smiles of adults watching children play a game they didn't understand, amused by our efforts to keep them out. Then, one of them tapped on the glass. A gentle, almost polite knock. When we didn't respond, it knocked again, harder this time. Soon they were all knocking, dozens of pale hands drumming against windows and walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to match our heartbeats. The sound built to a crescendo, then stopped. In the silence that followed, one of them spoke. "Come out," it said. The voice was soft, almost gentle, a woman's voice speaking with perfect English diction. It came from the pale face pressed against the parlor window, lips moving in careful synchronization with the words. But it wasn't the voice that froze our blood. It was the recognition. "Come out, Samuel," the thing said again. "It's Martha. I'm waiting for you." It was my great-grandmother's voice, Martha's voice, speaking from that elongated pale face with the enormous black eyes. The thing had somehow stolen her speech, learned the exact cadence and tone of the woman who'd shared Samuel's bed for 47 years. Martha herself stood beside me, very much alive, staring in horror at her own voice coming from that impossible mouth. "Don't listen," Samuel commanded, but his voice cracked. "It's not her. It's trying to trick us." But other voices joined the first. James's voice from the kitchen window, calling for his father. Little Sarah's voice from upstairs, asking why we were hiding from her. The voices of neighbors, relatives, people we'd known our whole lives, all speaking from those pale, distorted faces that pressed against the glass. "We've been waiting so long," Martha's stolen voice continued. "Come outside, Samuel. Bring the family. We have so much to show you." One of my young cousins, Tommy, started toward the window. His mother caught his arm, but he pulled against her grip with surprising strength. "That's Grandma Martha," he said. "She wants us to come outside." "That's not your grandmother," Samuel said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. The thing at the window smiled with Martha's face, and for a moment the resemblance was perfect. If not for those terrible eyes, you might have believed it really was her. "The children understand," the Martha thing said. "Children see clearly. Adults complicate everything with fear." More of our family began moving toward the windows, not walking exactly, but drifting, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. Their eyes reflected the lamplight, and I realized with growing horror that they were beginning to look like the faces outside. "Fight it!" Samuel shouted. He grabbed his youngest grandson and pulled him back to the center of the room. "Whatever they're doing, fight it!" But the voices kept calling. Mother voices, father voices, the voices of everyone we'd ever loved, all speaking from those pale mouths outside the windows, promising warmth, promising peace, promising an end to the fear that had gripped us for 6 nights. 3 more family members broke away from our group. They walked to the front door and began removing the furniture we'd stacked against it. Their movements were slow but determined, and when we tried to stop them, they fought with inhuman strength. "Let us out," said my cousin Mary, her voice dreamy and distant. "They're waiting. They've been waiting such a long time." Samuel raised his rifle, pointing it at his own daughter. "I won't let you take them," he said to the things outside. The Martha thing laughed, and it was exactly Martha's laugh, warm and familiar and completely wrong coming from that stretched face. "Take them?" it said. "Samuel, we're not taking anyone. We're offering them something better, something beautiful. Look." The pale faces at the windows began to change. The elongated features softened, became more human. The enormous eyes shrank to normal size. The stretched skin filled out, took on healthy color. One by one, the things outside transformed into perfect copies of our family members. I saw my own face staring back at me from the kitchen window, smiling with lips that were my lips, eyes that were my eyes. But the expression was wrong, too knowing, too old for a 12-year-old boy. "This is what we offer," the thing with Martha's voice said. "Perfection, no more pain, no more fear, no more death, just peace, Samuel. Eternal peace." More of our family moved toward the exits. They worked together now, coordinated, removing barricades with mechanical efficiency. The pile of furniture at the front door dwindled as boards and chairs were passed from hand to hand and stacked neatly against the walls. "Samuel," Martha whispered beside me. The real Martha, her face pale with terror. "What's happening to them?" I knew what was happening. I could feel it myself, a gentle pull in my chest, a whisper in my mind telling me how tired I was, how frightened, how much easier it would be to just stop fighting and join the pale things outside. The promise of peace was seductive. 6 nights of terror, 6 nights of watching death circle our home like a patient wolf. The offer of release from that fear was almost irresistible. But I remembered the cow in the barn, the peaceful expression on her transformed face just before Samuel shot her, the way she'd made that inhuman sound, that keening wail that had frozen our blood. That was their peace, not rest but replacement, not relief but erasure. "They're not offering us anything," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my young voice. "They're stealing us, taking our faces, our voices, our memories, making themselves into copies of us." Samuel looked at me with something like pride. "The boy's right," he said. "This isn't salvation, it's consumption." But it was too late for most of the family. They'd cleared the front door now, removing the last of our barricades. Cool October air flowed into the room, carrying that sharp metallic smell we'd noticed before. The smell of the pale things. 12 of our people stood by the open door, waiting. Their eyes reflected the lamplight like mirrors, and when they smiled, it was with too much knowledge for human faces. "Come," they said in unison. "Come outside. Come home." The pale things flowed through the doorway like water poured from a pitcher. They moved among our transformed family members, touching faces, whispering in voices too low to hear. Where they touched, the changes became complete. Our relatives became perfect copies of themselves, but hollow, empty, wearing familiar faces like masks. Samuel fired his rifle into the nearest pale thing. The bullet passed through it without effect, and the thing smiled at him with his dead son James's face. "Violence won't help, Father," it said in James's voice. "We're beyond such crude solutions now." The remaining untransformed family members, Samuel, Martha, myself, and 3 others, pressed against the back wall of the room. We were outnumbered, outflanked, and running out of options. "The root cellar," Martha whispered. "There's a tunnel." Samuel had dug the cellar years ago, extending it back into the hillside for winter storage. But he'd also created a narrow passage that connected to a natural cave system, an escape route in case of Indian raids that never came. "Can we reach it?" Samuel asked. The transformed family members and their pale companions filled the main room now, standing in perfect silence, watching us with patient eyes. They weren't advancing, weren't threatening. They were waiting, confident in their eventual victory. "The kitchen," Martha said. "The cellar doors in the pantry." We moved as one, backs to the wall, edging toward the kitchen. The pale things tracked our movement but didn't interfere. They knew we had nowhere to go. The hollow was surrounded, our escape routes cut off. But they didn't know about the tunnel. We reached the pantry, and Samuel pulled up the heavy wooden door that led to the cellar. Stone steps descended into darkness. The smell of stored apples and preserved vegetables rose from below, familiar and reassuring. "Go," Samuel commanded. "All of you, I'll follow." "Samuel," Martha began. "Go." We descended into the cellar, oil lamp in Martha's trembling hands casting wild shadows on the stone walls. Behind us, we heard footsteps on the wooden floor above. The pale things had entered the kitchen, moving with that same fluid grace. But they were taking their time, still confident, still patient. Samuel found the hidden entrance to the tunnel, a narrow opening behind the shelves of preserve jars. We squeezed through one by one, crawling through limestone passages that Samuel had carved years ago but never expected to use. The tunnel extended back into the hillside for maybe 50 yards before opening into a natural cave. From there, other passages led deeper into the mountain. We could lose ourselves in the limestone maze, emerge somewhere far from the hollow, make our way to safety. If we were lucky. We crawled through the darkness, following the weak circle of lamplight Martha carried. Behind us, we heard sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of flowing movement, like water finding its way through stone. They'd discovered the tunnel. We reached the main cave, and Samuel helped everyone through the opening. The cave was large enough to stand, with passages leading off in 3 directions. Samuel chose the one that angled upward, toward the ridgetop and eventual escape. "Hurry," he whispered. "They're coming." We moved as quickly as we could through the narrow passage, feeling our way along wet limestone walls. The lamp oil was running low, the flame growing smaller with each minute. Soon, we'd be in complete darkness. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Then, the passage opened into another chamber, and we saw light ahead. Not lamplight, starlight, filtering down through a crack in the cave ceiling. We were near the surface, Samuel found handholds in the rock and climbed toward the opening. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but it led to freedom. One by one, he helped us through the crack, out into the cold October night. We emerged on the ridgetop, high above the hollow. Below us, the Hendricks homestead sat in its ring of cleared ground, windows glowing with warm yellow light. It looked peaceful, normal, like nothing had happened. But we knew better. The pale things flowed out of the cave, opening behind us like smoke from a chimney. They moved across the ridgetop in perfect silence, surrounding us once again. But now we could see them clearly in the starlight, and the sight made us understand how small our chances truly were. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They covered the mountainside like a pale army, all wearing familiar faces, all watching us with those enormous dark eyes. Some wore the faces of our transformed family. Others bore the features of people we'd never seen. Faces stolen from other encounters, other sieges, other families who'd thought they could escape into the mountains. So many, Martha whispered. They'd been collecting faces for generations, building an army of human masks, preparing for something we couldn't comprehend. The thing wearing James's face stepped forward. "You can't run from what you are, Father," it said. "You can't escape what you're becoming." "We're not becoming anything," Samuel replied. But his voice lacked conviction. "Look at yourself," the James thing said gently. "Really look." Samuel raised his hands and stared at them in the starlight. His fingers had grown longer, more pale. His skin had taken on a luminous quality that matched the creatures surrounding us. We all looked at ourselves then and saw the changes beginning. The transformation had started the moment we'd entered their territory, been exposed to their influence. 6 nights of siege, 6 nights of their voices calling to us had begun the process of conversion. We were becoming what they were. Slowly, inevitably, whether we wanted to or not. "The change can't be stopped," the Martha thing said with my great-grandmother's voice. "But it can be embraced, made beautiful instead of painful." I felt the pull then, stronger than ever. The promise of peace, of belonging, of never being afraid again. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let the transformation complete itself, to join their pale ranks and find eternal rest. But I thought about the cow again, the way she'd sung in that inhuman voice before Samuel put her out of her misery. The hollow sound of the pale things' laughter, the empty quality of their smiles. "No," I said. The word came out louder than I'd intended, echoing off the ridge walls. The pale army stopped their advance, waiting. "No," I said again. "I won't become you. I won't let you steal what I am." Samuel looked at me with surprise, then pride. "The boy's right," he said. "We are what we choose to be, not what you make us." He raised the rifle and fired, not at the pale things, but at the oil lamp in Martha's hands. The glass shattered, the flame caught the spilled oil, and suddenly the ridgetop blazed with orange light. The pale things recoiled from the fire, their luminous skin seeming to absorb the flames rather than reflect them. For the first time since the siege began, they showed something that might have been fear. "Fire," Samuel said. "They don't like fire." We had matches, we had dry clothes, we had the desperate courage of people with nothing left to lose. Within minutes, the entire ridgetop was burning. Dry grass and fallen leaves caught quickly, spreading the flames in all directions. The pale things retreated before the advancing fire, melting back into the darkness beyond the light. But we were trapped in the center of our own blaze, flames spreading in a circle around us, eating up the oxygen, filling the air with smoke. "The cave!" Martha gasped. "Back to the cave!" But when we turned toward the opening we'd climbed from, we saw pale faces emerging from the crack in the stone. They'd filled the cave system below us, cutting off our retreat. We were surrounded by fire on one side, pale things on the other, trapped on a narrow ridgetop with nowhere to run. The flames grew higher, closer. The heat became unbearable. We pressed together in the center of the shrinking safe zone, watching our options disappear. Then Samuel did something I'll never understand. He walked toward the pale things, rifle in hand, directly into their ranks. They parted before him like water, watching with those enormous eyes as he approached the creature wearing Martha's face. "Take me," he said simply. "Let the others go. Take me and end this." The Martha thing smiled with his wife's lips. "Samuel, you don't understand. We're not taking anyone. We're offering everyone a choice." "Then I choose," Samuel said. "I choose to protect my family." He pressed the rifle barrel against his own temple and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the burning ridge, and Samuel Hendricks fell to the stone ground, free at last from their influence. The pale things stared at his body in what might have been confusion. They'd planned for resistance, for fear, for eventual capitulation. They hadn't planned for self-sacrifice. In their moment of uncertainty, the fire reached them. The flames swept across the ridgetop like a living thing, consuming everything in their path. The pale creatures tried to retreat, but the fire moved faster than they could flow. Where the flames touched them, they didn't burn. They simply ceased, fading like mist before the sun. One by one, the stolen faces dissolved. The army of pale things melted away, leaving only empty air and the smell of burning stone. Martha, myself, and the other two survivors huddled in the center of the blaze, protected by some quirk of wind and terrain that left a small pocket untouched by the flames. We watched the fire consume the mountain, watched the pale things disappear, watched the end of 6 nights of terror. When dawn came, the fire had burned itself out. The ridge was black and smoking, but we were alive. We made our way down the mountain, through the smoldering remains of the forest, back to the hollow where the Hendricks homestead stood untouched. The house looked exactly as we'd left it, windows still glowing with lamplight, as if the pale things had maintained the illusion even as they pursued us through the caves. But when we entered, we found only empty rooms. The transformed family members were gone, vanished like their pale controllers. Whether they'd been consumed by the fire or simply ceased to exist when their masters disappeared, we never knew. The other homesteads in the hollow were empty too. The Colemans, the Brysons, all gone without a trace, leaving only the physical evidence of their lives: clothes in closets, food on tables, beds that looked recently slept in. We were the only survivors of Cutter's Hollow. The authorities came 3 days later, summoned by smoke visible from Hopkinsville. They found a burned mountain, 3 empty homesteads, and 4 traumatized survivors telling an impossible story about pale things and stolen voices. The official report called it a tragic accident. Mountain fire, they said. The families had fled and perished in the flames, their bodies consumed by the blaze. The survivors had clearly suffered exposure and shock, their memories confused by trauma. Case closed, file buried. Truth edited into something the world could accept. Martha died 2 years later, never fully recovering from what we'd experienced in the hollow. The other 2 survivors moved west, changed their names, tried to forget. I was the only one who stayed in Kentucky, the only one who refused to let the story die. I'm 97 years old now. Heart disease, the doctors say. Maybe days, maybe hours. I've outlived everyone who was there, everyone who might have contradicted the official lies. The hollow is empty still. The state bought the land in 1923, turned it into a wildlife preserve. They say the ecosystem is recovering from the fire, that deer and turkey have returned to the burned ridges. But hunters avoid that country. Local people know to stay away. Sometimes hikers go missing in those mountains, their bodies never found. The Park Service calls it exposure, dehydration, getting turned around in the wilderness. Maybe that's all it is, or maybe something survived the fire. Maybe the pale things found deeper caves, darker places to hide. Maybe they're still there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to begin collecting faces again. I don't know. I only know what happened to my family in October of 1908. What came for us in the darkness. What my great-grandfather died to stop. I'm not telling this as a warning. The mountains will take who they take, and nothing I say will change that. I'm telling this because 23 good people lived in Cutter's Hollow, and they deserve to be remembered as more than a tragic accident. Because Samuel Hendricks was a hero who chose sacrifice over surrender. Because Martha died carrying the truth when the world preferred comfortable lies. Because the others who vanished that week were real people with real lives, not just casualties in some official report. Because the truth matters, even when nobody believes it. Even when the witness is dying and the story dies with him. This is what happened in Cutter's Hollow. This is what I saw. This is what I've carried for 89 years. The pale things are patient. They've waited before. They can wait again. But Samuel showed them something they didn't expect. He showed them that humans have a choice, that we can refuse their gift, that death is sometimes preferable to their version of eternal peace. They learned that night that we're not as easy to harvest as they thought. Make of it what you will.